The situation on the ground had crossed the line from dangerous into unthinkable. These were Navy SEALs, operators trained to adapt, endure, and fight through circumstances that would break ordinary soldiers. Yet now, pinned against unforgiving terrain with dwindling ammunition and no clear extraction route, even they could feel the walls closing in. The enemy held the high ground, using the ridge lines and ravines to funnel fire downward with ruthless efficiency. Every attempt to maneuver was met with immediate resistance. Every radio call answered only by static or distant denials. The battlefield had become a trap, and everyone knew it. Minutes felt like hours as dust and smoke hung in the air, turning visibility into a cruel joke. The SEALs had already executed every contingency drilled into them over years of training. Flanking attempts failed. Suppressive fire barely slowed the enemy advance. Medics worked silently and relentlessly, their hands steady despite the growing number of wounded. The team leader's mind ran calculations faster than words could form. Ammo count, casualty rate, enemy movement patterns. But none of the numbers pointed towards survival. The enemy wasn't just numerous, they were patient, tightening the noose inch by inch. Morale, that invisible yet vital weapon, began to fracture. Not panic, SEALs don't panic, but a heavy, suffocating realism. They understood what it meant when air support was delayed too long, when extraction birds couldn't risk the approach, when command stopped offering solutions and started asking how long they could hold. The unspoken truth settled among them. This mission might end here. They kept fighting because that's what they were trained to do. But the hope of victory had faded into a grim determination to delay the inevitable. Radio chatter grew shorter, more functional, no speeches, no heroics, just clear, clipped updates and acknowledgments. Each operator focused on the man beside him, covering angles, sharing ammo, dragging the wounded to marginally safer positions. The battlefield noise became a constant roar. Gunfire, explosions, shouted warnings, but beneath it all was a chilling calm. This was the calm of professionals who knew they were out of options. When the team leader finally reported their status, his voice carried a weight that said more than the words themselves. They were combat ineffective within minutes. The enemy knew it too. Their movement grew bolder, their fire more aggressive, sensing the kill was close. For the first time in the operation, the SEALs weren't planning how to win. They were calculating how to make their last stand count. That was the moment the story locks the audience in. Elite warriors stripped of advantage, facing overwhelming odds, not because they failed, but because the battlefield itself turned against them. It is the purest form of tension, when even the best have nothing left to give, and the outcome seems sealed. In that silence before the final push, with every man braced for what comes next, hope is gone, and that is exactly why what follows becomes legendary. No one on the ground knew her name in that moment. They only knew the voice when it finally cut through the chaos, calm, controlled, unmistakably confident. It wasn't the tone they expected. After hours of strained communications, broken promises of support, and distant command chatter, this voice sounded different. Steady, focused, female. That alone caused a brief pause among the SEALs, not out of doubt but surprise. On a battlefield where assumptions were formed in milliseconds, this was not what any of them had anticipated. She had been watching the fight unfold from above and afar, studying terrain maps, infrared feeds, and fragmented radio calls that painted a grim picture. Where others saw a lost cause, she saw patterns, enemy movement corridors, firing positions clustered too tightly, overconfidence baked into their advance. She didn't announce herself as a savior. She didn't need to. Her professionalism spoke first, followed by precise questions that told the SEALs everything they needed to know. She understood their situation completely. There was no hesitation in her voice, no need to prove herself. That confidence didn't come from arrogance, but from thousands of hours in the cockpit and an unshakable trust in her aircraft and training. She had fought this battle 100 times in simulations and real combat zones, learning how ground forces move when they are exhausted, how enemies behave when they believe victory is inevitable. She knew exactly where fear lived on the battlefield and how to erase it. For the SEALs, her arrival changed something internal before it changed anything tactical. It wasn't just that help had arrived, it was who that help was. Against the backdrop of relentless pressure and fading options, her presence shattered the narrative of defeat. She wasn't an abstract asset on a screen or a distant command decision. She was a human being choosing to fly straight toward danger for people she had never met. As she lined up her approach, the ground team felt a shift in momentum they hadn't dared to imagine minutes earlier. Enemy fire intensified, sensing movement above, but it was too late. She had already committed. In that instant, the SEALs realized this wasn't a rescue born of desperation. It was one driven by absolute control. She wasn't reacting to the battlefield. She was about to redefine it. The significance of her went beyond gender. It represented the unexpected edge, the variable the enemy never accounted for. In a fight where predictability meant death, she was the unknown factor that turned certainty into chaos. The SEALs had trained alongside pilots before, trusted them with their lives countless times, but this moment carried a different weight. It was proof that salvation doesn't always arrive in the form you expect. It arrives in the form that refuses to quit. When her aircraft finally broke over the ridge, it wasn't just metal and engines crossing into the fight. It was hope reintroduced with force, and for the first time since the mission began unraveling, the SEALs didn't brace for the end. They prepared to push forward again, knowing that somewhere above them she had their backs, and she wasn't leaving. The sound came first, low and rolling, cutting through the chaos like a warning growl from the sky itself. It wasn't the sharp scream of a fast jet passing overhead, nor the distant thump of artillery. This was deeper, heavier, unmistakable. Every soldier who had ever fought on the ground knew that sound, even before they saw the aircraft. The A-10 was coming, and with it came a shift in the balance of power that no amount of enemy planning could stop. As it crested the ridge, the aircraft looked almost prehistoric, broad wings, rugged frame, built not for elegance but for survival. It moved with deliberate purpose, slow enough to be seen, confident enough to be unafraid. The SEALs didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They simply watched, knowing that this machine had been designed for moments exactly like this, when friendly forces were trapped, outnumbered, and running out of time. The enemy reacted instantly. Their fire shifted upward, frantic and scattered, bullets and tracers clawing at the sky in a desperate attempt to swat down something they suddenly realized they could not intimidate. The A-10 didn't flinch. It flew straight into the threat, absorbing the chaos, its presence alone breaking the enemy's rhythm. For years, that aircraft had earned a reputation not through speed or stealth, but through reliability. It stayed when others left. It fought where others couldn't. On the ground, the effect was immediate and psychological before it was physical. Enemy fighters who moments ago had been advancing with confidence now hesitated, their formations unraveling. Cover positions that once felt secure suddenly seemed exposed. The battlefield, which had been shrinking around the SEALs, began to feel wider, as if space itself was being pushed back by the roar overhead. When the A-10 engaged, it wasn't reckless or theatrical. Every movement was measured, controlled, precise. It hunted the threat the way a seasoned predator does, not with haste, but with certainty. Each pass stripped away enemy strongpoints that had pinned the SEALs down for hours. Dust, smoke, and shockwaves tore through the ridge lines where the enemy had believed themselves untouchable. For the SEALs, the A-10 was more than air support. It was proof that they had not been abandoned. That somewhere beyond the smoke and confusion, someone had answered their call with overwhelming resolve. The aircraft didn't just suppress the enemy. It gave the team room to breathe, to move, to think again. Wounded operators were pulled to safety. Ammo was redistributed. Plans that had been shelved as impossible were suddenly back on the table. The myth of the A-10 wasn't born in briefing rooms or documentaries. It was forged in moments like this, where its sheer presence changed the outcome of battles before the last shot was fired. It was the embodiment of brute loyalty, an aircraft that existed for one reason only: to protect those on the ground, no matter how bad the situation became. As it circled overhead, unyielding and relentless, the message was clear to everyone watching. The fight was no longer one-sided. The SEALs were no longer alone, and whatever confidence the enemy once had was now buried beneath the thunder of a machine that had come to finish what they started. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when the flow of the battle broke apart and rearranged itself. Just minutes earlier, everything had been about survival, staying low, conserving rounds, protecting the wounded, and delaying the enemy for as long as possible. Now, with the sky alive above them, the rules had changed. The battlefield was no longer closing in on the SEALs. It was opening up, reshaped by force and timing into something they could finally control. The enemy felt it first. What had been a coordinated advance dissolved into confusion as their communication lines fractured under sudden pressure. Positions that once provided commanding views over the kill zone were reduced to liabilities, exposed to angles they had never anticipated. The confidence that drove them forward evaporated, replaced by hesitation and fear. They had prepared to defeat men on the ground, not a relentless presence in the sky that saw everything they tried to hide. For the SEALs, this shift was more than tactical. It was psychological. Training snapped back into focus. Movements became sharper, faster, purposeful again. The team leader issued new orders, not to hold, but to maneuver. Elements that had been pinned for hours began to advance, using the chaos above to reposition and reclaim ground that had felt lost. The wounded were moved with urgency instead of desperation, protected by overlapping fire and renewed momentum. This was the turning point the mission had been missing, the moment where the story of defeat was interrupted and rewritten. Every pass overhead peeled away another layer of enemy resistance, creating gaps where none had existed before. Those gaps became opportunities, and the SEALs were experts at exploiting them. What minutes earlier had been an inevitable collapse was now a calculated counterstroke. Timing made it decisive. Had help arrived earlier, it might have been just another phase of the fight. Had it come later, there might have been no one left to save. Instead, it arrived at the exact moment when resolve was all that remained. That intersection between exhaustion and endurance is where true turning points are born. The SEALs didn't need to be told the significance of it. They felt it in the way the battlefield suddenly responded to their actions again. The enemy, sensing control slipping away, attempted to regroup, but the rhythm was gone. Their movements became reactive, their choices forced. Each attempt to reassert dominance was met with overwhelming consequence. The initiative had shifted, and with it, the fate of the engagement. Momentum, once lost, is difficult to reclaim, especially when it has been seized with such finality. In the end, this moment defined everything that followed, not because of sheer destruction, but because of clarity. The fog of inevitability lifted, replaced by purpose and direction. The SEALs were no longer fighting to delay the end. They were fighting to finish the mission. And once that switch was flipped, there was no going back. From a distance, the scene could have been mistaken for something pulled straight from a war film, but on the ground it felt sharper, louder, more real than anything ever captured on screen. The ridgeline, the rising dust, the thunder rolling across the valley, all of it blended into a moment so vivid it burned itself into memory. This was the kind of battlefield image that didn't just tell a story, it demanded to be remembered. Every sense was overloaded, every detail amplified by the knowledge that lives were hanging in the balance. The aircraft's roar echoed off the terrain, bouncing through the rocks and cutting across the gunfire like a physical force. Even without looking up, the SEALs could track its movement by sound alone, each pass announced by a deep, relentless growl that sent a message both to friend and foe. For the enemy, it was terror made audible. For the men on the ground, it was reassurance, a signal that the fight had shifted in their favor. Visibility came and went in waves, as smoke and debris churned through the air. Sunlight flashed between clouds and dust plumes, illuminating fragments of motion figures diving for cover, shadows stretching across the ground, equipment scattered where moments earlier there had been order. The battlefield had become a living canvas, constantly changing, shaped by motion and noise. It was chaotic, yet strangely clear in purpose, every element pushing toward a decisive conclusion. What made the moment cinematic wasn't just the scale, but the precision within the chaos. Movements on the ground synchronized instinctively with what happened above. Hand signals, shouted commands, and practiced reactions unfolded seamlessly, like a sequence rehearsed 1,000 times but never truly expected to be needed. Each second carried weight, each decision leaving a visible mark on the outcome. The power of the scene lay in contrast. Human vulnerability against mechanical dominance. Exhausted operators pressed into the dirt while overwhelming force thundered overhead. The intimacy of close combat paired with the vastness of airspace control. That contrast created an image that lingered long after the noise faded. A reminder of how quickly fortune can turn when timing, skill, and courage intersect. When the dust finally began to settle, what remained was not just silence, but clarity. The terrain looked different now, reshaped by action and consequence. What had once been a trap was now an escape route. What had felt like the end had transformed into a hard, one continuation. The SEALs would carry this image with them, not as spectacle, but as a lesson etched into experience. This is why such moments resonate far beyond the battlefield. They translate effortlessly into story, into imagery that audiences can see and feel without ever being there. The roar over the ridge, the sudden reversal, the overwhelming presence of salvation arriving at the last possible second. These are the elements that turn events into legend, not because they are exaggerated, but because they are unforgettable.